The night was busy at the upscale restaurant, which sat at the heart of the city. It was the kind of place that attracted people who liked to show off, and tonight was no different. The air was full of chatter and laughter as guests in expensive suits and dresses sat at tables, enjoying their meals and each other's company. The conversation flowed easily, often centered around achievements and possessions. People boasted about their latest trips abroad, the promotions they had earned, and the exclusive parties they attended. There was one table in particular where the talk was getting louder by the minute. A group of people had gathered there to celebrate, and it seemed as if the louder they talked, the more they believed in their own importance. The way they spoke, with no regard for anyone around them, made it clear that they thought the world should revolve around them. They were proud of their wealth, their power, and their success. But as they spoke, there was one person who was different from the rest. Behind the scenes, away from the spotlight and the praise, was someone quietly working hard. She moved through the crowd, balancing plates and drinks with practiced ease. She didn't look out of place in the hustle and bustle of the restaurant, but if you looked closer, you'd see a calmness in her demeanor that stood in stark contrast to the rest. She had been working in the restaurant for years and had learned to tune out the noise. She knew her place here, and she didn't mind it. But tonight, something about the conversation at that one table was getting to her. The pride, the arrogance, the way people looked down on others, it was starting to wear thin. She had seen it all before. The constant boasting, the assumption that because someone was in a position of power or wealth, they were somehow better than others. It was a feeling she knew too well. It wasn't that she didn't respect people who were successful. It was the attitude of superiority that bothered her. She had worked just as hard, and in some ways, harder than many of the people she served. Yet, here she was, the one who was often overlooked. The group at the table continued their conversation, unaware of the subtle tension building in the room. They laughed loudly, making jokes about the little people who worked in places like this. Their comments were casual, but they carried an air of disdain. And that was when she heard it. The comment that went too far. One of the men, with a grin on his face, looked at her as she approached their table to take their order. "Just a waitress, huh? That's all you'll ever be," he said, his tone dismissive. The words stung, but she didn't react immediately. She kept her composure, smiled, and took the order as professionally as always. But deep down, something shifted. She had heard similar words before, but this time they felt different. The words weren't just directed at her. They were a reflection of how many people in the room viewed her and others like her. It wasn't just a job. It was a reminder of the way people saw her. Small, insignificant, just another face in the crowd. As she walked away from the table, she knew she couldn't let it slide this time. She had dealt with people like this before, but today something inside her felt different. Maybe it was the constant build-up of such attitudes, or maybe it was just the right moment for a change. Either way, she wasn't going to let their arrogance go unchallenged. She had a story to tell. The evening went on, and the noise from the table of proud guests grew louder. Their conversation shifted from casual talk to more exaggerated claims. They started boasting about how successful they were, about how they had earned everything they had through hard work, or so they claimed. The longer they spoke, the more they seemed to feed off each other's egos. They threw around words like exclusive, elite, and untouchable, clearly believing they had reached the top of the social ladder. The group made jokes about how people like them had the world at their feet, while people like her, pointing casually in the direction of the waitress, would always stay in the background, serving them. At that moment, one of the women at the table laughed and said, "I bet she has no idea what it's like to be in our world. Probably just here to pay her bills." As the words left her mouth, the rest of the group chuckled, completely unaware of how hurtful their words were. But their laughter didn't reach the waitress. She stood by the side, gathering her thoughts, trying to hold on to her professionalism. But the comment, like so many others she'd heard over the years, stuck with her. Despite the hurt she might have felt, she wasn't the kind of person to snap back or make a scene. That wasn't her style. She knew that in a place like this, where everyone was looking for the next best thing, a response from her might just fuel their egos even more. Instead, she chose to stay quiet for the moment, but her mind was racing. She wasn't angry, at least not in the way they thought she would be. It wasn't anger that fueled her decision now. It was a quiet resolve. As she walked back to the kitchen, she felt her mind clear. She knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to let them get away with this, not in her restaurant, not in her world. She wasn't just a waitress, and she wasn't just someone who had to stand by silently while others assumed they were better than her. It was time for her to speak up, but not in the way they expected. She returned to their table moments later, a calm but determined look on her face. They barely noticed her at first, too busy congratulating themselves on their achievements. But she wasn't about to let them keep speaking without understanding that their words had consequences. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and asked if they were ready to hear something that might make them rethink everything they were saying. The group looked up at her, surprised by her sudden boldness. The woman who had earlier made the remark about her paying her bills raised an eyebrow. "What could you possibly have to say that's of any interest to us?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. But the waitress didn't back down. Instead, she smiled softly and said, "It's a story about someone who started just like me. Someone who worked hard, didn't complain, and eventually proved everyone wrong." She wasn't sure if they would listen, but she was certain that her story, though simple, would do what their fancy words couldn't. It would make them stop and think. As she spoke, the group fell silent. They were curious now. Maybe it wasn't what they expected. Maybe it was the quiet power in her voice or the way she spoke with confidence, but they were listening. For the first time that evening, the chatter around them quieted down, and the room seemed to focus on what she had to say. It wasn't just about the waitress serving them. It was about something deeper, something that connected all of them, regardless of their title or position in life. The group fell into an unexpected silence as the waitress began to speak. There was something different in her tone, something calm but firm. She wasn't just going to accept being judged anymore. She didn't wait for anyone to speak, instead continuing with a steady voice that carried through the quiet of the room. "It's funny," she started, her eyes scanning the group. "How everyone thinks that success is about being the loudest person in the room, the one with the biggest salary or the most expensive car." She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "But sometimes real success doesn't look anything like what people expect." A few of the people at the table exchanged confused glances. They clearly weren't used to being spoken to in this way, especially not by someone they had dismissed so easily earlier. One of the men, trying to regain control of the situation, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Okay, so what's your point? Are you saying you're some kind of success story just because you wait tables?" he asked, half joking but with a tone that suggested he didn't take her seriously. But the waitress didn't flinch. She didn't get rattled by his words. Instead, she took a deep breath and continued, her voice unwavering. "I'm not here to argue about your version of success," she said. "I'm here to tell you about someone you probably wouldn't expect, someone who started exactly where I am, working hard, day after day, with no guarantees of anything." "Better." The group was starting to lean in now, their curiosity piqued by her unexpected confidence. Even the woman who had mocked her earlier was quiet for once, waiting for the waitress to continue. "There was a man," she said slowly, "who worked in a small diner, just like I do now. He was a server, just like me. He didn't come from a wealthy family, and he didn't have fancy connections. But he worked hard. He treated every person who walked through the door with respect, no matter who they were. And you know what? One day, someone took notice of him." The group was silent now, the boastful energy of earlier completely gone. "This man went on to build a business that changed the world. He wasn't born with a silver spoon. He didn't just wait for success to come knocking. He worked for it, every single day. And the key to his success wasn't being the loudest voice or having the most money. It was understanding that the work he did mattered. It mattered to the people he served, and it mattered to him. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. The room was still, everyone hanging on to what she was saying. You might be wondering what this story has to do with me, or with any of us here, she continued. But the truth is, we're all more alike than you think. Success doesn't come from what you wear or how much you boast. It comes from what you do when no one is watching, and how you treat people, whether they're serving you your dinner or sitting next to you in a meeting. The group was still quiet, their previous arrogance replaced by an uncomfortable awareness. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected someone like her to stand up and speak her mind in a way that made them stop and think. One of the men, who had been particularly loud earlier, shifted in his seat, looking a little embarrassed. He opened his mouth to say something but stopped himself, as if unsure of what to say. The waitress gave him a small, knowing smile. She wasn't looking for an apology. She didn't need one. All she wanted was for them to understand that true success isn't about the status you hold or the things you have. It's about the integrity you bring to everything you do. Anyway, she said, her voice softening, I just thought it was worth sharing. You never know who's watching, or who's going to surprise you with something you didn't expect. The table was quiet now, and she knew that the conversation had changed. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about the way she had made them see the world in a new light, even if just for a moment. And that was enough. The group sat in silence for a few moments after the waitress finished her story. The chatter from the rest of the room seemed far away now, like it was coming from another world. For the first time, the guests at the table weren't thinking about their own accomplishments or boasting about their success. Instead, they were thinking about the words she had just shared and how they had made them feel. The man who had made the comment about her earlier was the first to break the silence. His voice was quieter now, not filled with the usual arrogance. So, you're saying that just because someone works hard, they can change their life? He asked, almost as if he was trying to wrap his mind around it. The waitress nodded, her expression calm. Exactly. Hard work doesn't always mean you'll get instant rewards, but it builds something over time. It teaches you things that you can't get from just talking about how great you are. And who knows, maybe one day someone will notice your effort, just like the man in the story. Another woman at the table, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. I never really thought about it like that, she said, almost as if she was reflecting on her own life. I mean, we're all so focused on what we have now, we forget about the effort that went into getting there. I guess it's easy to forget where we started. The waitress smiled gently, appreciative of the fact that her words were being understood. It's easy to forget, yes, she replied. But the journey is what shapes us. It's what gives us the strength to deal with challenges. It's not about looking down on anyone else or thinking you're better than them. It's about lifting yourself up, no matter what your starting point is. The mood at the table had shifted completely. The arrogance that had been so thick in the air earlier had disappeared, replaced by a sense of humility. Even the woman, who had made the rude remark about her earlier, was now looking down, lost in thought. Another man, who had been quiet throughout the conversation, finally spoke. I think I understand now, he said, his tone thoughtful. I've been so focused on what I have and where I am that I've never really stopped to appreciate how I got here, or the people around me who helped me along the way. The waitress didn't need to say anything in response. She simply nodded, happy to see that her message was being heard. She knew she wasn't trying to change their entire perspective on life in one conversation, but maybe, just maybe, she had helped them see things a little differently. For her, that was enough. As she turned to leave, the man who had been the most vocal earlier called out to her. Hey, he said, his voice more sincere than before. Thank you for sharing that story with us. It made me think about things in a way I haven't before. I appreciate it. The waitress paused for a moment, looking back at the table. She wasn't expecting an apology, nor did she need one. But the fact that they were taking her words to heart was all the thanks she needed. "You're welcome," she replied with a small, genuine smile. "Sometimes, a little reminder is all we need." As she walked away from the table, she felt lighter. She hadn't started a big argument, nor had she made anyone feel bad. She had simply shared something meaningful, something that made the people around her pause and think. It was the kind of change that didn't happen with grand gestures, but with small, quiet moments. And in that moment, she knew she had made a difference. The group, now more reflective, went back to their meal, but the atmosphere had shifted. There were no more jokes at the waitress's expense, no more comments about how much better they were than others. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were thinking, reflecting, and in some cases, even learning. The waitress had done something far more powerful than any argument. She had made them rethink their attitudes, and in doing so, she had shown them the value of humility, hard work, and respect. As the night went on, the table that had once been filled with loud chatter and pride now sat in a more thoughtful silence. The boisterous laughter had faded, and the group seemed to be reflecting on the words they had just heard. It was as if the waitress had done something they hadn't expected. She had made them see themselves in a new light. They weren't used to being confronted with humility in such a direct way, especially not by someone they had so easily dismissed earlier. The man who had initially mocked her earlier sat back in his chair, his posture now different. He wasn't slouched or arrogant anymore. He was sitting upright, almost as though he was still processing everything she had said. The others at the table, who had laughed along with him, were now quiet, lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't a dramatic change, but there was a shift in the air. The woman who had made the comment about her paying her bills was the first to speak, but this time her voice was softer, more genuine. "I didn't realize how wrong I was," she said, almost to herself more than to anyone else. She looked around at the others. "I guess I got caught up in all the things I've been told success is supposed to look like. I never really stopped to think that there's more to it than just having the money or the title." The man who had asked her about success earlier nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I've been so wrapped up in my own world that I never really thought about what it means to work hard for something. And I definitely didn't think about the people who are working behind the scenes, making things happen every day." It was clear that the group was starting to understand something they hadn't before. It wasn't just about wealth or status, it was about respect and effort. The waitress hadn't tried to shame them or preach to them. She had simply shared a story that helped them see beyond their narrow view of what success meant. For a moment, it felt as though they were all on the same level. They weren't patrons and staff anymore. They were just people trying to make their way in the world. The man who had been so dismissive earlier looked up at the waitress, who had returned to the kitchen to check on orders. He opened his mouth to speak, but it wasn't the same sarcastic remark he had made earlier. Instead, his voice was more thoughtful, almost apologetic. "Hey," he called out to her, his tone more respectful now. "I want to thank you for what you said. I think it's something I really needed to hear." The waitress, who had been moving around the kitchen, stopped for a moment and looked at him. She didn't expect anything more than a simple acknowledgement, but she could tell from the way he said it that he meant it. She nodded at him, offering a smile that was sincere, but not overly warm, just a recognition that her words had made an impact. "You're welcome," she said softly. "I just hope you think about it next time you look at someone who seems below you." The man's face softened. "I will," he said, nodding slowly. The others at the table seemed to follow his lead, each reflecting on their own actions and words. There was no big moment of reconciliation, no dramatic apologies or heartfelt confessions, but there was a subtle change in the air, as if everyone had learned something important without needing to say it out loud. The waitress didn't expect any grand gestures. She wasn't looking for validation or recognition. All she wanted was for them to understand that no one was truly below anyone else. The person serving your meal might be the one who, through quiet determination, goes on to achieve things you couldn't imagine. And in that simple truth, there was power. By the end of the night, the group had finished their meal and the atmosphere had completely changed. The laughter and pride of earlier had been replaced with a sense of quiet reflection. They weren't just patrons and staff anymore. They were people who had shared a moment of understanding. The waitress returned to clear the table, and this time, the group didn't mock her or make rude remarks. Instead, they nodded at her respectfully, almost as if to acknowledge that she had given them something far more valuable than a meal. She had given them a lesson in humility and respect. As she walked back to the kitchen, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't caused a scene. She had simply shared something that had resonated with them, and in doing so, she had reminded them, and herself, that there's more to life than what we see on the surface. Sometimes, the people we overlook are the ones who hold the most powerful lessons. As the night continued, the group sat quietly, finishing their meals. The energy in the room was different now. There was no more boastful laughter, no more unnecessary chatter about expensive vacations or promotions. The mood had shifted from one of arrogance to reflection. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and they were no longer the same people who had walked in that evening, full of pride and self-importance. The waitress, who had caused this unexpected change, was back in the kitchen, preparing for the next wave of orders. She wasn't looking for praise or acknowledgement. She had done what she set out to do. She had planted a seed in their minds, and now it was up to them to nurture it. She knew she couldn't change their entire perspective in one conversation, but maybe, just maybe, she had helped them see things from a different angle. Outside the kitchen, the group was still sitting at the table, but their conversation had taken a new direction. They weren't talking about themselves anymore. Instead, they were discussing the waitress's words, trying to understand what had just happened. The man who had been the loudest earlier spoke up first. "I've been thinking about what she said," he began, his voice more serious than before. "And, honestly, I didn't really get it at first. I mean, she's a waitress, right? What could she possibly know about success? But now that I think about it, maybe she has a point." The others at the table were listening intently, eager to hear where he was going with this. He continued, "I've always thought that success was about the money, the status, and all the things that come with it. But what if it's more about what you do when no one's watching? What if it's about how hard you work, even when you don't get credit for it?" One of the women at the table nodded slowly. "I guess I've always been focused on the wrong things. I've been so obsessed with climbing the ladder, I never really stopped to think about what's really important." She was right when she said it's about respect, about treating people well, no matter where they come from or what they do. Another person chimed in. "I think we've all been so caught up in our own little bubbles that we forgot what it means to be humble." She was just doing her job, but she said something that made us rethink everything. I'm not sure if I would have heard it from anyone else. The group fell into a quiet moment, each person processing what had just happened. They were starting to realize how much they had taken for granted. They had judged others based on their appearance, their job, or their status, without ever considering that someone else's journey might be just as valuable, if not more so. One of the men, who had been particularly dismissive at the start of the evening, looked up at the waitress, who had returned briefly to check on the table. He hesitated for a moment before standing up and walking over to her. The others watched, curious to see what he would do. When he reached her, he stopped for a moment, and then, with a genuine tone, said, "I just wanted to say, thank you. You've made me rethink a lot of things tonight. I've always been so focused on myself. I never really thought about how my words and actions might affect others. You've given me something to think about." The waitress looked at him for a moment, a small smile forming on her face. "You're welcome," she said simply. "I just hope you carry that with you." He nodded, his face more thoughtful than it had been when he first arrived. "I will. I don't think I'll ever look at things the same way again." As he returned to his seat, the group seemed to collectively exhale. They weren't sure what had changed, but something was different. Now, it was subtle, but it was there. The night had started with arrogance and pride, but it had ended with humility and understanding. The waitress didn't expect any grand gestures. She didn't want them to make a big deal out of it. She didn't need to hear them apologize or confess their wrongdoings. All she wanted was for them to leave with a new perspective, even if it was just a small shift. She had planted the seed, and now it was up to them to decide how to grow it. As she went back to her work, she couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about making people see the value in others, no matter their position in life. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected places. And in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had helped teach them something that would last longer than any of their boastful stories ever could. As the night drew to a close, the group sat quietly at their table, finishing their drinks and reflecting on the conversation they had just had. There was no more loud laughter, no more boasting about personal achievements or wealth. The usual chatter about cars, houses, and vacations was gone. In its place was a sense of quiet introspection. They had started the evening full of pride and confidence, but now they were looking inward, thinking about what they had learned and how they could change. The waitress, who had started this entire shift in their thinking, was going about her work in the background, unaware of the small but significant change she had made. She was focused on her tasks, as usual, clearing plates, checking on tables, and making sure everything was running smoothly. But there was something different about the way the group looked at her now. They were no longer looking down on her or treating her like someone they could dismiss. They were looking at her with a new kind of respect, as if they had seen her in a completely different light. As the group prepared to leave, the man who had been the most dismissive earlier stood up. He had been thinking a lot about what the waitress had said. He realized that his earlier attitude had been based on assumptions, on looking at people based on their job or their status. He had never stopped to think that the person serving him could have a life story that was just as important, just as meaningful as his own. He walked over to the waitress, who was finishing up some work near the door. The others watched, curious to see what would happen next. When he reached her, he paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then, with a genuine tone, he spoke. "I just wanted to thank you," he said, his voice softer than it had been all evening. "What you said really made me think. I was so caught up in my own world. I never stopped to realize that success isn't just about money or status. It's about what you do with the opportunities you're given and how you treat others along the way." The waitress looked up at him, surprised by his sincerity. She didn't need any acknowledgement or recognition. She had simply done what felt right. But hearing this from him, after everything that had happened, felt like a small victory. "I'm glad to hear that," she said with a gentle smile. "It's easy to get lost in our own little bubbles and forget what really matters. But it's never too late to start thinking differently." The man nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You're right. I'll remember that. I don't think I'll look at people the same way again." As he turned to walk back to his seat, the rest of the group followed his lead. They were quiet, but there was a sense of shared understanding between them. They had come into the restaurant with a sense of superiority, certain of their own success. But by the end of the night, they had learned something valuable. Success wasn't about how loud you could talk or how much you could boast. It was about the effort you put in, the respect you gave others, and the humility to recognize that no one is above anyone else. The waitress, having no idea that her words had caused such a shift in their thinking, continued her work. She wasn't looking for applause, or for them to suddenly treat her like she was special. All she had wanted was for them to stop and think about how they treated people, especially those who didn't have the same status or visibility. And, from the looks on their faces, she could tell they had learned that lesson. As they paid their bill and left the restaurant, they did so quietly, each of them lost in their thoughts. There was no grand farewell or thank you, but there didn't need to be. The real change had already taken place. They had left with something more than just a full stomach. They had left with a new perspective. The waitress, for her part, was content. She had done her job, and she had done it well. She had also done something more. She had changed a few minds, not through confrontation or anger, but through a simple story and a quiet truth. And in that small way, she had made the world a little bit better, just by being herself.